Welcome back everybody to another video. Today we're looking at The Devil Within SATGAT. SATGAT, not sure how to pronounce it. I'm going to take a look at the proposed minimum requirement of this Metroidvania kind of game that came out April 9. And the needs are quite basic and quite generic. You need a quad-core 2.4 GHz, 4 GB of RAM, 2 GB card GPU, 15 GB of hard drive, and internet to install the game. So this game can be played offline. Nice, finally. So I plug in my lowest of the lowest quad-core that I have, which is the i5 650, a first-gen i5, which is at 3.4 GHz. A bit higher than what they say for quad-core at 2.4, but more on that later on the video. Then 4 GB of memory and a GTX 950. This is a 2 GB card, quite performing for this kind of game, but let's see. This game have a all review of very positive, so that's why I get my attention and decide to make a video about it. And the first result is having a GTX 950, I can play at 1080p ultra settings and having a 47-45 FPS average. The GPU isn't at its maximum possible usage, and the CPU still have some headroom also. The 4 GB of memory is completely used though, using 3.4 GHz and the remaining for the Windows to run in the background. Since they don't specify which CPU, they don't specify resolution and the target FPS, this is quite a good guess. I mean, who still have a first-gen i5? Then I decided to try the infamous GT 1030 and the GDDR5 at it, and at 1080p I was able to reach a 35 FPS at high settings. Finally a game that the GT 1030 can play. Yes, I'm aiming to be 1080p 30 FPS for this kind of game. So I'm trying to figure out which 2 GB card you should use. But keep in mind, during my whole session with the GT 1030, the game was stuttery like hell. It's barely unplayable. Having dropped to the 9 FPS time to time, it's not acceptable. Next up was the RX 550 2 GB variant. And this one I had to play at medium settings because I had a lot of a drop in FPS. I have an average of 40 FPS, but I had a lot of dip in the 20s. And trying at high settings, the stuttery mess become worse than the GT 1030. So you can play with this card if you keep it at medium settings. I'm still at 1080p also. And my last GPU for this CPU was the GTX 650 Ti Boost, a little monster for its time. But it still can do the job for today's time for this kind of game, I guess. Because at 1080p high settings, we have an average of 38 FPS, and it was quite stable with really a few stutter when the assets load for the first time. So a new game can be played on aging old PC. This is the zenith of budget PC gaming. Then I remember I have the granddaddy of quad-core, a Q8200. This is a 2.33 GHz CPU, quad-core. So after dusting it out from its box, I decided to try if it's still functional and try a different other 2 GB card. So yes, 2.33 is a bit lower than 2.4, but let's see how it fares. Still with 4 GB of memory and 1080p resolution. The first card I tested with this CPU was the GTX 750 Ti, a 2 GB card that should give enough power to play this game. The setting is at high and I have an average of a 34 FPS. And both the CPU and the GPU are pegged almost at 100%. So I guess this is the best CPU GPU combo you can get, but we are at high settings. Normally, often, the minimum requirement is to play at low settings. So let's drop the GPU a notch. So I dropped in a GTX 660. The setting at medium, I get an average of 33 FPS. This is highly playable, and it was quite smooth gameplay. The GPU was in 90% of utilization without being pegged, so maybe you can play some settings at high. And the CPU was having some air to breathe at 80% utilization. Now, obviously, the 4 GB of memory was maxed out. Then the last card for this video testing is the R7 370 2 GB variant. And setting up this card at 1080p, we need to be at low settings to reach an average of 31 FPS. So I guess this is the 2 GB card they were talking about. Can also say that was also the CPU they were talking about. If you round up 2.33, it will be 2.4. So this video that was supposed to be proposed minimum requirement is more like a real minimum requirement. And we find out which was the real device to get to the proposed minimum requirement, I guess. That means the winner for the real proposed minimum requirement is the Intel Q8200 4 GB of memory and the R7 370 2 GB. And that you need to play at 1080p to reach 30 FPS at low settings. On that note, thanks to have come watching. See you in the next one and subscribe. And I leave you with the remaining of the trailer.